So you have this reshoring going on. You have cheap natural gas everywhere. So you can kind of rebuild the whole industrial area of the US. Like there are a whole number of things that could create a lot of growth in the US that are going to push this inflation maybe beyond what everyone's expecting. And can you help me kind of work through that? The first part being, is this debt to GDP? How does that impact things when you have rising rates and then this reshoring that's occurring? I mean, I don't know. To me, it seems like inflation could be substantially higher.
On the higher rates in a higher debt environment,
Hmm.
I think um, it's important to get down to the cash flows. Who's paying what
Yeah.
as a function of those higher rates. And so, if you think about businesses and households, their interest expense hasn't meaningfully increased because mostly what they did is lock in low fixed term loans for a long time,
Right.
or issued long term
Yeah.
bonds. And so, um, a higher interest rate environment will be corrosive to their cash flows over, if it existed for 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, as you have to refinance. Like even homeowners, people move, they die, they get married, they get divorced, whatever. Like, there's children, like people have to move. And so eventually those mortgages will be reset, but that's very, very slow moving. So if you just think about that, for those borrowers, there's not a lot going on in terms of the higher interest rate environment. Obviously, for the government side, the duration of government debt is quite a bit shorter. Obviously, 25% is in floaters, whatever, T-bills, and a fair amount of the debt stock is getting repriced on an annual basis. That debt service has risen, and the question is, who earns that debt service? Who gets that debt service? Yeah. A fair amount of that debt service goes either to non-GDP oriented savers, so like a pension fund, or it's going to rich people. And to a lesser sense, going to corporations. But mostly what's happening is it's going to, if a pension fund gets 5% more income, what do? They go buy some financial assets, that's for sure, but they don't create GDP. If a rich household gets that income, remember, it's the last dollar in, right? And so, what does the spending profile look like for, let's just say, a homeowner or a household who has $1 million of income? What's that dollar of, $1 million to $1,001, right? Their propensity to spend that dollar is essentially zero, which is quite a bit different from, traditional income growth. Let's say if you added the extra dollar to the median income, at $50,000, it would be very different. And so the the GDP impact of the higher debt service or the higher debt payments, particularly from the government, is relatively de minimis. And really the story is much more about the fact that, like, most households, 96% of households are employed, and they're earning income, and that income's going up 5% a year. Like that's pretty good in terms of when it comes to spending. I think the sort of longer term dynamic, which you point out related to the reshoring story, I think is really important, in the sense that, like, we went through, most of us, all we've known up until COVID was like 40 years of disinflation, globalization, peace. All three of those very important, right, in driving this low inflation environment. And if you just sort of think about, globalization rolling back and peace maybe not being as, a conflict not being as low as it has been over the course of the last 40 years, those things are very inflationary. Now, onshoring is good for growth, good for US growth, and bad for inflation, right? From the perspective of, like, what we did for 40 years was find the lowest cost producer in the world and have them produce it, rather than have, it produced domestically. So there's a trade-off there. There's many reasons why you might want to reshore supply chains, both, economically as a business to create duplicate supply chains or durability in your supply chains. There's also, geopolitical reasons why you might want to onshore your production. It's just a trade-off, though. It's good for growth and it's bad for inflation. That's all there is to it. And so I think part of that story is, we've sort of all, as investors and savers, have looked at the world in this disinflationary growth, strong growth lens over the course of the last 30, 40 years, built portfolios that benefit from that, particularly like 60-40. But if we're instead going to maybe inflationary growth or inflationary weak growth, the portfolios that you want to have as a saver, long-term saver, are pretty different in those environments than what we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years.